The material for this lecture comes from Chapter 6, so make sure that you read this chapter thoroughly to prepare you for the quiz, and pay close attention to pages 73 through 75, since I won't have time to cover those pages in depth. This week we are looking at arguments for God's existence. This is going to be the theme for the next several lectures. And so I want to begin by talking about the arguments for God's existence more in general, and it will help to look at some key terms and concepts to help us gain some appreciation for just exactly what we're arguing when we're arguing about the existence of God. And one important concept is the concept of theism. Now, theism might be understood conceptually as God, who is a transcendent, personal, and necessary being, is the explanation for why the spatial-temporal universe exists. And so if you ask a theist, what is real, or what are the various parts of reality? From a theistic perspective, the answer is the universe is real, but the universe does not exist on its own. The universe is simply one part of a reality that owes its existence to another part of reality that's more fundamental, namely to the existence of God. And so that's theism. Another concept is naturalism. So naturalism, as opposed to theism, might be understood conceptually as the universe exists and that's it. If you're a naturalist and then you ask the question, what is or what are the various parts of reality? The answer is, what is real is the universe. Nothing exists outside the universe, and so to use the words of the famous naturalist Carl Sagan, the universe is, all that was, and all that ever will be. There is no other reality outside the box of the universe. Understanding the distinction between theism and naturalism is important if we are to fully understand the traditional arguments for God. A couple other concepts to look at is polytheism. So polytheism says that there are various gods who exist conceptually within the spatial-temporal universe. And so we might think of such notions of gods or goddesses as, let's say, Artemis, the Greek goddess, or Zeus, or Thor, or a popular notion today, the flying spaghetti monster. Now, when I say that these gods exist conceptually inside the spatial-temporal universe, I don't mean to suggest that they necessarily have physical qualities that we could observe. Rather, what I mean is that these types of gods are not conceived as transcendent personal creators of the space-time universe. That's not the type of gods that these are, just conceptually. So theism is a very different thing than polytheism. Now, a similar term to polytheism is henotheism. And henotheism really has the same concept of God as the polytheistic concepts, but the difference is that henotheism argues that there is only one true God, or at least one God that is above all others. So you could be a henotheist and, believe that there are other gods, but just say that there is one top dog God. And we might say that it's Zeus, or we might say that it's some other god. But the idea is that there's really one top god or one true god. Now, I bring up the distinction between polytheism and henotheism at this point to highlight a common and popular misunderstanding regarding the traditional arguments for God. The traditional arguments for the existence of God are not intended to demonstrate the existence of just any polytheistic deity. That's not their intention. Rather, the traditional arguments for the existence of God are intended to demonstrate that theism is more reasonable than naturalism. And so that's the purpose. And I bring this up because um, within the last decade, there have been a number of books talking about the existence of God, whether or not God is reasonable or not. And one popular one is by the prominent biologist and naturalist Richard Dawkins, who wrote in his book, The God Delusion, that many theists are actually atheists when it comes to Zeus, or Apollo, or Amun Ra, or Mithras, or Baal, or Thor, or Wonton, the golden calf, or even the flying spaghetti monster. But Dawkins says, as an atheist, I just go one God further. This sentiment represents a popular complaint against traditional theism, and yet it seems to make a very simple category mistake. It seems as though Dawkins is attempting to say that theists today recognize the implausible notions of the ancient Greek gods, but yet they can't see the implausibility of their own notion of God. And so, according to Dawkins, just randomly picking one god to believe in out of all the various gods that people have believed in is simply unreasonable. He says that the theists reject various polytheistic gods of the past, but they can't even reject their own notion of God. And what Dawkins seems to be doing is he seems to be setting up the argument in that there's polytheism, there's henotheism, and then there's atheism. And so if polytheism is unreasonable, then it follows that henotheism would be unreasonable, or at least we should see that it's unreasonable, and therefore the only reasonable position is the atheist position. But what I want to point out is that this discussion is not the same discussion as the theism versus naturalism discussion, and this is not what the traditional arguments for the existence of God is all about. And so, to understand why this is a category mistake, let's look again at theism versus naturalism. To ask whether theism is more reasonable than naturalism, or to ask whether naturalism is more reasonable than theism, is a very different question than asking whether or not there is some superhuman goddess named Artemis living somewhere in the cosmos. So, conceptually, if Artemis were to exist, the evidence for her existence would be discovered by looking within the spatial temporal universe. And note here that that type of evidence is consistent with a theistic universe, just as it would be consistent with a naturalist reality. So, whether you're a theist or a naturalist, conceivably you could still find evidence for Artemis in the universe. This actually is not all that different than the question of aliens. Do aliens exist? Well, conceptually, to answer that question, you would have to look with inside the space-time universe. Now, to date, we haven't found any evidence for aliens, but we do know that this is a big universe, and who knows, maybe someday we will find evidence. But the reality is, the question of the existence of aliens, or of the existence of Artemis, or of Zeus, or of flying spaghetti monsters, those types of questions are conceptually different questions than the debate between theism and naturalism, and so we ought to treat them as such. So now we move on to our first specific argument. We just got done considering arguments in general, the way we frame the arguments. Now we'll specifically look at the cosmological argument for God's existence. So what is a cosmological argument? There are several things to say, and I'll just start by pointing out that there isn't one version of the cosmological argument. There are many versions of the cosmological argument. And so the cosmological argument is actually a class of arguments that begin with the assumption that the universe exists. So we start with the universe, and that something outside the universe is required to explain its existence. All versions of the cosmological argument maintain that the universe is a contingent reality. So to be a contingent reality means that it doesn't exist out of necessity. It's possible for the universe to not exist. That's what it means for something to be contingent, that it's possible for it not to exist. And so all versions of the cosmological argument maintain that the universe is contingent rather than necessary. So to understand what this means, it might help to look at various articulations of the argument. So one common articulation is what's known as the first cause argument, that was articulated by Thomas Aquinas. And so we'll look at the form of this argument here real briefly. So this argument states that there, there exist things that are caused. That's the first premise. There are some things that are caused. Premise 2, nothing can be the cause of itself. 3, there cannot be an infinite regress of causes. 4, there exists an uncaused first cause. 5, the word God means uncaused first cause. Conclusion, God exists. Let's walk through this argument premise by premise. So the first premise seems true enough. Many things in this world do have causes, which is fairly uncontroversial. We experience causes all the time, so that one seems true enough. What about premise 2? Well, this also seems true because if something were the cause of itself, then it would have had to have existed prior to causing itself to exist, which is a contradiction, and thus it's nonsense, and so it seems like premise 2 is true. This brings us to premise 3. There cannot be an infinite regress of causes. Well, how would this premise be supported? Why can't there be an infinite regress of causes? Nothing seems incoherent with the notion, since we can imagine, say, an infinite set of numbers, so why couldn't there be an infinite regress of causes? Well, the answer to this question is usually to say that an abstract infinite, like numbers are abstract things, an abstract infinite is conceivable, but an actual or a concrete infinite is not. So that's the common comeback to that question. Why, since the notion of an infinite regress isn't inconceivable, why say that there can't be an infinite regress of causes? Well, the quick answer is that, well, we're talking about an actual infinite, not an abstract infinite. And we'll come back to this point in a moment as we look at the next articulation of the argument. But for now, we'll proceed and see where the argument goes. So premise 4. Premise 4 really is arguing that if premise 3 is true, so that needs to be established first, but let's assume for the moment that premise 3 is established and it is true, then it must be the case that there is an uncaused first cause. Now I want to point out that premise 4 does not contradict premise 2, because saying that a thing could cause itself, which is what you would need to say if you denied premise 2, is to utter a meaningless statement. It's to utter a contradiction. So the notion itself would be incoherent if premise 2 were false. But now it's not incoherent to say that a thing has existed forever. That notion is not incoherent. To say that there's a thing that's existed eternally, forever, without a cause, that is not to utter a contradictory statement, and so 4 is distinct from 2. But again, for premise 4 to be true, premise 3 must be true. So what about premise 5? The word God means uncaused first cause. This notion certainly needs to be explored more, and many say that this doesn't seem intuitively to be true from the start. And so why would we say that the word God necessarily means an uncaused first cause? Could there be other uncaused first causes? And this is something that certainly needs to be explored more and will take up in later articulations of the argument. But this is the Aquinas version of the cosmological argument. And next we'll move on to the Kalam argument, which is recently been revised by the theologian William Lane Craig. And this argument is similar to the previous argument, but it's stated more concisely. Premise 1 of the Kalam argument says that whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Now, while there have been some debates about premise 1, and these debates usually center around David Hume's challenge to whether or not cause and effect relationships can be verified empirically, for our purposes, I don't want to dig into those debates because most people take premise 1 to be intuitively true. That doesn't mean there aren't important discussions to be had there. It just seems like for our purposes that it's outside of the scope of what we want to dig into. And so for the moment, I'm just going to assume premise 1 to be true and move on to premise 2. Because this is actually the most debated premise, and it's where we'll focus most of our attention right now. Are there good reasons to think that the universe began to exist? Well, Craig offers 2 lines of reasoning in support of premise 2. He gives some philosophical arguments and a scientific argument, and his philosophical argument proceeds as follows. Premise 1, and again, this is a defense for premise 2 of the argument above. So premise 1 says that an actual infinite number of events cannot exist. Premise 2, a beginningless series of events in time entails an actual infinite number of things. Conclusion, a beginningless series of events in time cannot exist. To demonstrate premise 1 of this argument, Craig makes a distinction between an actual infinite and a potential infinite. A potential infinite is an increasing number of things or an increasing number of events that are moving toward an actual infinite, but they never actually get there. They potentially will get there, but they never do. And the reason they never do is because you can always add one more thing to infinity, which means that there is always a limit because you can always add. So what does that mean? Well, Craig uses an illustration to explain what he means by this, and he takes the thought experiment that was set forth by the German mathematician David Hilbert, who wrote about a theoretical hotel with an infinite number of rooms. And this thought experiment is popularly referred to as Hilbert's Hotel. And if you want a brief 60-second explanation for the significance of Hilbert's Hotel, I'll refer you to a video that I uploaded onto D2L in the Cosmological Argument tab. You can go there, watch it. It'll explain Hilbert's Hotel in 60 seconds. But in short, Hilbert's Hotel is meant to demonstrate for Craig that an actual infinite is impossible. If there were a hotel with an infinite number of rooms, and if that hotel had an infinite amount of guests, then it would mean that there would be no vacancies or no open rooms in the hotel. But now let's suppose if a guest named George decided to stop by the hotel and reserve a room. Well, we know if there are an infinite number of people in the hotel and there are only an infinite number of rooms, we know that there would be no vacancies in the hotel, and so we would say, well, George is simply out of luck, there's no vacancies. But the reality is, when we're talking about infinity, you can always increase it. And so when George comes, to create space for George, all we would need to do is move the person in room 1 down to room 2. And then we would move the person who's in room 2 down to room 3, and the person who's in room 3 down to room 4. And then we would proceed to do that all the way down to infinity, thus creating space for George. And so, though there were vacancies in the hotel, an infinite number of rooms filled with an infinite number of guests, we were still able to produce a vacancy, and therefore George has a place to sleep. And this thought experiment shows that an infinite number of rooms can be filled and vacant at the same time, which just is a puzzle about the nature of infinity. So you might ask, okay, how does Hilbert's Hotel relate to the premise in question, premise 2, the universe began to exist? Well, for Craig, if an actual infinite number of events cannot exist, then it follows that the universe cannot be infinite. Because if there were an infinite number of moments before the present moment that we exist in right now, it follows that we would never arrive at this present moment because it would take an infinite amount of time to get here, which we would never be able to actually accomplish. And so Craig says that this is just an absurd notion, and therefore the universe must have a beginning to get us away from this absurd notion of infinity. And so that's Craig's philosophical argument supporting premise 2, but he also offers a scientific argument, and the scientific argument relies upon the validity of Big Bang cosmology. So we don't have the time to explore the science involved here, but I will say this just to be brief. Big Bang cosmology shows that the universe originated from a dense singularity. And what that means is that all of space, all of time, all of matter, energy, radiation, and anything else that's contained within the physical universe came into existence at the singularity. Space, time, matter, energy, and outside of that, it must be non-spatial, non-temporal, non-physical reality. So now the singularity, according to Craig, would have originated from something that is not itself, since again, a thing cannot cause itself. This means that the universe must have had a cause that is distinct from anything that we know within the universe, and this cause must be spaceless, timeless, and immaterial. Therefore, for Craig, from a cosmological perspective, or from modern cosmology, Big Bang cosmology, Craig argues that the universe must have had a cause for its existence. And so now, suppose we accept this argument. Suppose we accept this argument. Does it necessarily demonstrate the existence of God? In the first cause argument that we saw with Aquinas, we saw that Aquinas just assumed the uncaused first cause must be God. But why assume this? What can we really know about the nature of the cause of the universe? And this is an important question to ask when we're talking about the cosmological argument, and we need to think about how we articulate the argument. So let's trace the argument from where we've been so far. So the cosmological argument begins with the existence of the universe. And the first step in the argument, we want to ask whether or not the universe was caused or uncaused. The cosmological argument argues that it's false to say that the universe is uncaused, and so you provide reasons for showing why that's false. And so at this point in the argument, as we're tracing it, we have a universe that is caused. Well, now what can we know beyond this? Well, we might say that the cause of the universe can move further into saying that either this first cause is a self-caused, or that this first cause is a transcendent cause. Now, we mentioned earlier that to say that a cause is self-caused is a contradiction, which means that that would be false. And so it leaves us with a transcendent cause of the universe. Now, to say that a cause is transcendent, all we're saying at this point is that cause is outside of the universe. It exists independent of the universe. It's not time, it's not space, it's not matter, it's not energy. Because if it were any of those things, then it would be a self-caused universe, which would be a contradiction. And so at this point, as we're tracing the argument in the cosmological argument, we come to a transcendent cause of the universe. So now what is the nature of this transcendent cause? Well, here we can break down the argument further and say that either there's a personal transcendent cause or there is an impersonal transcendent cause. If we argue that there is a personal transcendent cause, then we have a notion that's really close to God or some sort of transcendent mind. This is why Aquinas says that the first cause is obviously God, and why other proponents of the cosmological argument try to say that the first cause is God, is because they think of that or conceive of that transcendent first cause as being a personal first cause. But of course, it could also be an impersonal transcendent cause, and if that were the case, we might say that the first cause was simply nothing. Now, nothing in this case is just a term referring to an impersonal, transcendent first cause of the universe. There's no intelligence behind it, there's no mind behind it, there's no guidance, there's no intention. And so either there is a personal transcendent cause, which we might call God, or there is an impersonal transcendent God. Now, the cosmological argument in itself does not demonstrate which of these notions is more plausible, but it does help us articulate the nature of the debate regarding whether or not theism or naturalism is more plausible. And so that's one thing to note here. The next articulation is the argument from contingency, which was made famous by Samuel Clarke. And many philosophers of religion say that this is actually the most persuasive cosmological argument. But this argument relies specifically upon the concepts of necessary versus contingent beings. And these are concepts that we're going to take up further when we explore the ontological arguments for God's existence. And so I don't want to go into too much depth here. But I do want to spell out the argument briefly, and then we'll move on. And then when we get to the ontological argument in a couple lectures, we will dig into this concept more. But here's how Clarke formulated the argument. Premise 1, every being that exists is either contingent or necessary. 2, every being can be, not every being can be contingent. Conclusion, there exists a necessary being upon which the contingent beings depend. 4, a necessary being on which all contingent beings exist is what we mean by God. Conclusion, God exists. Now, if this argument seems confusing for you at the moment, hopefully this will become clearer when we get to the ontological argument. But all you need to know for the quiz at this point is that it's important to understand the distinction between contingent and necessary beings, because many of the cosmological arguments rely upon that distinction. So there are many nuances of the cosmological argument that we could look at, but I think at this point we've gotten a good introduction. And so we might end by asking about the merits of the argument. And to answer this question, there are usually two questions that are posed. First, does this argument, or the various articulations of this argument, get us to God? That is the cosmological argument a proof for God's existence? And the answer is probably not by itself. But perhaps maybe that shouldn't be the intention of the argument. If one sees it not as a proof for God, but as an articulation of the theism versus naturalism debate, then it certainly seems like this would have some merit, at least for that purpose, maybe not necessarily for a proof for God's existence, but it has merit in that it helps us articulate the debate in question. Which brings up another question. Does this argument tell us about the nature of God? Well, certainly not entirely. After all, this argument doesn't tell us whether or not there is one cause or whether there are many transcendent causes. This argument also doesn't tell us whether or not the first cause, if it's God, is still alive today. It doesn't tell us whether or not this God is good or whether this God is evil. It doesn't even tell us really whether or not the first God is a personal being. What it does do, however, is clarify why theists argue that a personal transcendent first cause is at least one reasonable explanation for the existence of the universe. And in doing so, this argument provides a starting point for having a discussion regarding whether or not naturalism or theism is a more reasonable explanation concerning the nature of existence. And so, for this reason, and there would be other reasons we can bring up, but for this reason, it seems like the argument certainly does have merit. And so that's all that we have for our lecture on the cosmological argument. As you prepare for your quiz, again, make sure that you pay close attention to pages 73 through 75, as I simply glossed over those pages in this lecture.